Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, where we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experience. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology who'll be bringing you their perspectives on how digital transformation is reshaping the way we recruit, engage, and graduate learners. You'll hear firsthand accounts of how institutional leaders are developing their strategy, as well as get deeper on the stories of how these EdTech tools are being built to foster better student outcomes. With that, let's get to today's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another live episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast. We are here speaking with Tanner Jackson, head of AI products at ETS. If you're following along, we're about midday on day 3 of the event, second day of interviews for us here, but excited to kind of have an episode solely dedicated to talking about AI in higher education and ed tech, and getting into kind of like responsible use and stuff like that. We'll have another conversation, and I think it's kind of in a similar vein from a very different vantage point. But I'm excited to have you here, Tanner. If you want to briefly introduce yourself and your background, and then we'll go from there to kind of talk more about your work at ETS and responsible AI integration.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. So my name's Tanner Jackson. As you said, I'm the head of AI products. Originally, I come from a research background, so I got my PhD in cognitive science back in the early 2000s. Been working on AI for education since then, mostly around conversation-based assessment, adaptive learning environments, game-based assessment, and then using AI to craft a lot of those environments. So I've had positions in research for AI, cognitive science, done a lot of product work for developing products. How do we kind of take AI capabilities and turn them into products that are helping people in classrooms for various purposes? And then I've also been leading businesses, looking at skill measurement for the workforce and preparing people for the workforce. And also as part of our Office of the CEO, I'm looking at how we're pushing on strategic initiatives inside of a large company. And which has kind of led me into my path now, which is how are we using AI across all of our products at ETS? So how are we generating content, delivering assessments, and even scoring that content? How do we kind of help to scale that up in a lot of our efforts for our programs and subsidiaries? So it's a really exciting position, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, it's built on, sounds like a lot of your background to be in a position like this now at ETS. So just in case folks aren't aware, if you can explain briefly the work of ETS and and I guess anything more that you might want to talk about with your role there.
Yeah, absolutely. So ETS stands for Educational Testing Service, or at least that's where it's coming from. Mm-hmm. We also kind of do a lot of talent solutions, but ETS is a very large-scale assessment company. So we do things like NAEP, which is the Nation's Report Card. So if you ever hear about 4th, 8th, 12th grade reading literacy rates and how they go up or down, we kind of administer that program. We also do that internationally with PISA and PIAC, so multiple countries around the globe running those. But we're more well known for a lot of the tests that we deliver, like the GRE, the TOEFL, which is for English speaking coming into a university. And then we also have things like TOEIC, which is looking at English for business purposes. And then Praxis, teacher licensure. So the majority of states in the United States require teacher licensure, and Praxis is one of those assessments. So we do large-scale, predominantly education-based assessments. So what that means is we sometimes don't have all the context that might come from a classroom. So how do we help to make sure that we are delivering these assessments that could involve people from a variety of countries? How do we do that fairly? How do we do that validly? How do we do that reliably? That not only means like, how do we create the content that's relevant or at least appropriate for all of these audiences? How do we deliver that stably? Like sometimes people do test in the classroom, but it's not for classroom purposes. And then how do we score that across all of those people, where they're coming from, the kind of information and claims that we want to make? And so this is like a predominantly high stakes assessment is where ETS is known for.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of those acronyms and things very familiar to folks, whether they've taken those tests themselves or maybe facilitate or evaluate candidates that have taken those assessments and everything. But just having you on, it was just felt like a good opportunity. One, to kind of speak about your work at ETS and how AI is being responsibly integrated there. But just imagining that you may kind of talk shop with a lot of other folks who are just going to have a perspective on this topic of responsible AI integration into ed tech products. So yeah, just talk about, the ways that you're seeing that at ETS and maybe any other organizations, or just like what you're, hearing from like clients and other folks about like, this sort of issue or topic.
So this is something that's very critical for ETS. And so one of the things that we think is a differentiator, that responsible and ethical use for AI. ETS actually has a long-standing history of like standards in assessment. So we have all these standards. We've held ourselves to them for years, even pre-AI. So all of our products and programs are audited for like fairness, validity, reliability. Are we disadvantaging any certain groups? So we have a history of making sure that what we're doing is fair. It's like it's representative across multiple groups, and no one is like systematically or unfairly kind of being assessed or measured in some way. So we take all of that background that's pre-AI, and we're bringing a lot of that with us now into how we implement AI. So do we know, like, how are these models trained? Are there potential biases in the model? How are we then applying them? Are we applying them in the way that's going to actually generate the claims that we want to make? And we also do it for things like security. How do we help to either monitor things? And so we're using, and one more thing is we just launched a new AI center. So this is fairly new, so I want to make sure I mention it. But there's a new AI center for ethical responsible use. And so happy for people to go and check out that. That was launched recently. And then how I'm hearing about it some with other people, it's interesting. I hear a mix. So like in some cases, I love that teachers feel enabled to go and make their own assessments. They can make their own products. Like now with vibe coding and all that stuff, everybody can make things that's their own purpose. Where I see that potentially running into problems in the future is, are people making things and then not doing so responsibly? They're understanding how they're going to, the data privacy issues that might be in there if they're doing stuff for their students, and what data to put into AI. And so that's one of the things that we're kind of coming back on is like, what happens to the data? So what goes into it, but also what comes out of it? And then how do you store that? And so I've seen, I think there's a few different places where I see AI being used, where it matters about being responsible. So the first is content generation. The second is assessment delivery. And the third one is scoring. In that first bucket for content generation, a lot of people are starting to use that. They're generating either their own assessments, own educational materials. And so one question is, when you start to make it and it looks good enough, are there potential problems that you might not be able to see? Are you using words that might advantage or disadvantage certain groups? Mm-hmm. Is it going to like take them out of like the assessment mode? And so for high stakes, like mostly what ETS does, it's really critical for us to adhere to our original standards on AI. And so while we're generating a lot of content with AI, we still have humans in the loop for all of the reviewing. And so we have humans at very critical, important parts for all that human judgment and validation. In delivering the assessment, it's how do you make use of maybe a live learner model when you're actually keeping track of what that learner's abilities are? How do you interpret that fairly? How do you kind of make sure that you are still addressing and providing an equitable assessment to different people, even if that assessment might look slightly different? Mm-hmm. And then in scoring, it's looking at like, are we picking up on the right things? And so we have a long history doing that with humans. We've been doing AI scoring since the early 2000s, and now we're trying to explore what is an LLM or something like ChatGPT or Claude. What are those kind of models? How do they do scoring differently? And exploring to see like are we actually capturing the right kinds of things in order for us to then come back and say, all right, this isn't a person's skill. Have we made the right assumptions underneath that? And so we're exploring a lot of those. So those are the kind of three buckets that I think you'll see used in a variety of different ed tech products.
Yeah, I appreciate that full context and kind of giving a tip of the hat to that resource. We'll definitely link out to that for folks to check out. But yeah, that was like what was coming to mind that you made kind of the point about is like, the culture at ETS, I think, is well suited to enable responsible AI integration. Like you're saying, like really being kind of beholden to, standards and, kind of channeling maybe different tools or methods and things to fit within that, and how can we do that maybe more effectively and efficiently versus like folks kind of getting a little too kind of infatuated with the like efficiency, that idea of like you kind of just get something and you're like not really interrogating it, but it might be a little like, mediocre, underwhelming, like that idea of like, oh, cool, it answered my question. Like, I'm just going to, so I think that idea of like humans being able to, stay in the loop and evaluate things and see, maybe just different models, being better or worse or something, or just the way that you present information or, ask for feedback or whatever else. But just always being kind of thoughtful about, I think with a lot of things, it'd be hard to just sort of like fully kind of delegate and not, kind of investigate, what you're kind of getting out of some of these platforms. Because I think, again, it's sort of like a starting point that it would like kind of get you a good deal of the way of wherever you're trying to go. But like you still obviously need to do some of the work. And then like that idea of like, I know for me, on that sort of like content generation front, it might be like, okay, here are like just a bunch of kind of starting points for like a title of a podcast episode or, some sort of summary or, the description that you might put in or whatever else. But, I'm still looking at it and reading through the whole thing. And sometimes it's like, okay, I'm like, tinkering with more or less of it, but, I still feel like I kind of have my fingerprints on it. But
I think it's cool that AI is going to allow people to do more and explore into new domains than they ever could in the past. And so like, if I'm going into I may not have a finance background, but with AI, I can learn a lot more about that. The problem is that like when we do that, I might not know enough about finance to know what parts are correct and what parts aren't. And so like, I think for like teachers in a classroom or in higher ed or whatever, they're going to have enough domain knowledge to basically say, when this output comes out, like this is going to be okay for me to use in my classroom. This is not, whatever. But for students, it might not be. Because for them, they're going to see it and it's going to look good enough on the surface, but they might not have developed enough domain knowledge yet to say, okay, does seem right or not. And I think that's where you can fall into that trap of like the good enough, which is typically okay, can lead to a trap if you don't have enough knowledge in that space to then critically evaluate it. That human judgment point, I think, is going to be key moving forward.
Yeah, I think that is a good call out. And I think a lot of this is, where I think we're kind of like hopping around kind of interchangeably of talking about sort of dynamics maybe more prominent in K through 12 or higher ed, whatever. But it's even just like why I like being, at events like this sort of intersection of everybody is the acknowledgement of like, these are like dynamics that are impacting tomorrow's college students, like they're sort of coming up in like these sort of environments. So knowing kind of like, what are they learning about? How are they learning about it? And what's sort of like the, just kind of the climate, the ecosystem, the just kind of greater forces that they're sort of coming through their, K through 12 schooling with. But I think seeing that there's some approaches and platforms that provide sort of a like kind of structured or kind of guided sandbox with AI to kind of play with, where you might like show your work to your teacher and, they might just be able to like, support you through seeing how you got to some sort of answer, the prompts that you used, or, even just kind of set clear expectations around like, you can use AI for this portion of the assignment, or you can't use it at all for this one, or you like versus either just being like broad blanket, policies or whatever else. So I think that's sometimes like the responsible and like the very micro level responsible AI integration, just like procedurally of like kind of contouring to like individual assignments or courses or different things like that, as it sort of makes sense to do that. But
yeah, and I was talking with somebody earlier this morning, and I thought there was an interesting, we were kind of juxtaposing a little bit K-12 education, higher education. In K-12 education for AI, like, if a teacher's using AI to develop an assessment and like it's not perfect, they're gonna know the student well enough and have enough observations of the student that they can fix it and be like, oh, maybe that was just my assessment that I messed up, or that was just my learning. In higher ed, depending on that like course structure, you may only get one opportunity to kind of measure that student, or like you see that one end of the paper. That's where you're going to run into the risk of like how to design that so that either AI is a part of it or not. And where you're not going to necessarily have the chance to go back and correct kind of your representation for how you understand what that student knows and can do. And so I think actually there's interesting differences there in terms of how many either opportunities or how well they can know a student to then make AI more or less risky in terms of implementing it into the class or it being considered cheating or not as part of that. So there's definitely different trends, I think, there.
Yeah, and I guess just anything else you want to say about like why this is so important to kind of get right. Like I think there's kind of a confluence of things that are happening right now in terms of like kind of accountability or, relevancy of certainly, higher education and all that. But like just kind of like the, sort of gut check, like, okay, we can kind of talk all about this, but like what makes this so important from your perspective?
Yeah. So I think there's two main reasons. One is accountability and one is preparedness. So on the accountability front, I really think that as educators, it's our responsibility to prepare people for the future of workforce. If these students or if these people are coming out and they don't know how, where, and when and why to use AI, then we have not prepared them for the future. So, but we as educators shouldn't. I get concerned when it comes up to we should either ban or only allow AI. It's got to be somewhere in between, and that's part of like the role of an educator. And so, as a former professor, like I would think about this like I'm not going to use this for everything, but I need to use it for some things. And I need them to know how to use it or at least make good decisions with it in the future. And so how do I either model that for them or incorporate that as explicit like expectations? But I feel some accountability that we need to help improve that literacy and understanding like discernment about where, when, and why, because there's expectations in the workforce that they're going to know how to use it. That expectations are rising for AI literacy. That is not going to go away whether we include it in school or education programs or not. And so like if we want to prepare these students for what the rest of their careers are going to look like, we have to be using that and modeling that so that they're familiar with those. And like one of my concerns is if you haven't been using it, then you're not going to be willing to trust what it can do, or you might be using it for either the wrong ways or the wrong purposes or the wrong parts. And so you have to build, it's a muscle that we have to have ready. But when you come into the workforce, it's both an explicit assumption that you have those, but sometimes it's implicit. And it's moving so fast that it's going to be hard to catch up with. And so I think that we should be accountable as educators to do that appropriately and responsibly for the students. So it's not just about is the AI being implemented responsibly? I think it's like, are we educating them on students on how to make those choices responsible, and then being prepared for the future.
Yeah. All really good points. And I think, it's that idea of like impacting how we're teaching and what we're teaching about. And then just like, that kind of permeates, could or should permeate like any course, just that idea of like, like you're kind of getting out of like, when is it appropriate to use if you're writing a paper or, trying to make a study guide or like doing different things or whatever, just providing guidance on that. And again, just not kind of making those sort of blanket policies. And I guess just, that idea of advocating for, kind of responsible, ethical AI use and everything. And I think that a lot of kind of, like with everything that you shared, I think it's that idea of like that philosophy being kind of baked into, whatever tools and platforms any ed tech company, is putting out there. And even like with what you said is that idea of like being aware of the answers that you get. It's like humans made this stuff. Like there's implicit bias in that. So like that being something that I kind of got in my mind when you were talking earlier of, you use it to create an assessment and like you all again just kind of culturally have the sort of awareness of like we need to evaluate like is this sort of disadvantaging a certain population and if you weren't interrogating the way that AI is maybe helping you build assessments, you could sort of like veer like and sort of undermine the work that you'd been doing for years or something. But all that to be said, how do you see ed tech organizations like leading on this topic in terms of like maybe creating parameters or guides or resources or support, to do these sort of things. And then maybe how do you see institutions, leading on this topic?
Yeah. So I think the first and foremost is transparency, like talking about some of these issues. So just by asking that question, I think it's important for us to kind of surface those. I mean, one model that this might be a little bit controversial to say, but I have really appreciated Anthropic's approach to we will be putting in safeguards. We will say no to things that don't seem reasonable. We are not just on the say yes to everything train. I think that's the kind of like transparency that should be happening more in this industry, especially around ed tech. And because there's a lot of stuff under the hood that can be a black box. And so if you just toss somebody's response into like an LLM, large language model, or like ChatGPT or Claude, and you get something back, you might not know how it actually arrived at like a score or something. But that transparency, I think, is really key. And so I know for us, one of the things that we will do is I personally would rather sacrifice a little bit of precision to make sure I can explain how I arrived at that answer. And so when we're working with AI, it is make sure that everything is explainable. And so that level of being able to say, you can trace back to where all that information came from. You can check sources that way. You can look at like what either mathematical or statistical methods were used. When we come to a decision, sometimes that has an impact on somebody's future. So if we can't back that up with something, then should you trust that source or not? So I think for anyone in edtech, I think that transparency is going to be key in terms of like how it's used, what's coming out of it, what's going into it. And that I think I like the Anthropic model in terms of how open they are. But we had this problem. Now everybody knows that they had a hack or something or whatever. But now you can trust that if something in the future happens, they will probably be open and honest about it instead of trying to hide it. That's the kind of thing that I think we should lead with.
Yeah, definitely. I think, just take a beat here before, talking kind of on the institutional front, because I think, that's what I've appreciated seeing, that some people are building some of the like kind of AI empowered kind of tailored products and education to do precisely that. Like if it's sort of, okay, we're kind of putting this in a walled garden of like, it's referencing faculty's like, content or, different things. So you could like basically ask the professor, as they're doing like prep for their courses or whatever else. And then like, it shows how it got to a certain answer or whatever. Like just generally that idea, like there's a lot of different examples and I'm just one that kind of popped in my head, but just the idea of you get a response from one of these platforms and it gives you the resources. Like, I think that's such a strong direction in that like transparency piece and certainly in education, but. And
I think, they might provide the sources there. What's interesting, I don't know if you've seen this previously, but, there were some companies who were using AI to develop reports for a given customer. I'm trying not to throw anyone under the bus here. But when they did that, they generated all the reports and it had sources, but nobody checked the sources. The sources actually weren't real. And so if you don't go in and actually check where it came from for real, even though it looks great, it might not actually be based on real information. And so I think, again, even like having those, like, got to check them or you got to figure out that way. So it's interesting, like, how this is being used and the kind of implications that has on society.
And I guess that makes me think of just, the other point of like how institutions can lead on this is like certainly, you write papers, you got to cite your sources and that sort of thing. Like that culturally, I think being a good impact, but that idea that like they can, put in learning outcomes and different things around like AI literacy. And I've just been appreciating with kind of the conversations I have on this topic where like this is coming up much more early, and kind of at the forefront than like, social media and different things were coming out that people kind of were like, mentioning like digital literacy and that sort of thing. But now it's like, okay, this feels like a paradigm shift. Like, we're talking about this and how it's going to have, all these like societal impacts, but being much more aware of like, we need to make sure that people are literate with how to use these tools. So I think, that can be an area of like, how institutions can lead is like bring their culture into the mix and the conversations and the utilization of these technologies. And then, just be very conscious about like embedding expectations around AI literacy, pretty readily. And obviously like kind of defining what that means from, you as the institution that is like going to be kind of validating their learning, being literate. Just curious your thoughts on that, about how institutions can play a part in leading on this.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely do. And I think one of the things, I think there's going to be some growing pains. And the growing pains for both institutions as well as educators, because what we've historically relied on as sources of truth or sources of evidence for our students' or learners' abilities may not be valid anymore. So it used to be the case that, you would have a student write a paper. That paper would include, that would be evidence of, they can synthesize, they can go and read through the research. They can synthesize information. They can present it in a coherent argument for communication purposes. Now, none of those now they might all be in the paper, but none of them might come from the student. So if you're still going to measure those same things, how to do research, how to think critically and synthesize an argument, how to communicate and put it into one package, a paper may no longer be the right method of doing that. Oddly, it might be going back to an oral exam or having a conversation like we are, where I can't produce my answers with AI right now. So I have to rely on either my own existing knowledge or apply it in some way. Now, that might look a little more subjective, but you can kind of standardize that in some way. But I think there's going to be growing pains in terms of like what we've traditionally used. But now that AI can do so much of those, I think that's going to have to be a way that educational institutions lead by showing that change. taking that growth and saying, you know what, given these problems, here's how we're going to either change our curriculum or changing the way that we're going to either collect evidence or move that forward. And so I think that's where, and it would be awesome if some of these are starting to do that and then like kind of sharing, this is what we've learned. I often kind of, there's a few groups that I talk with regularly, and a lot of these institutions are, whenever I ask them like, okay, please raise your hand if you're excited about AI. And most of the room will raise the hand. And please raise your hand if you're scared of it. And then they almost all raise their hand. And so I think it's still trying to figure out like, practicing it enough and then talking and sharing those learnings to help bring other educators along. Because overall, AI now has the ability to fulfill the promises of personalized education that were made 20 years ago. So we all thought that AI could like help to close achievement gaps and help to make personalized education. Everybody gets their own personal tutor. But now that can be a reality. And so how do we actually kind of do that responsibly, and how do we kind of help build things up to that level?
Yeah, a lot of great perspectives. And I think, I've had folks kind of just sharing in some recent conversations that idea of like loving being a part of higher education because like people are so kind of collaborative and sort of, coming to events like this and doing, their show and tell of like, their approaches, their successes, their challenges and all that. And I think, that's going to be definitely a way of, institutions can be, doing those kind of collaborative sort of sharing around this and like, sharing resources or whatever it might be, but, through their networks helping to lead because, folks at, certain levels, whether it's a faculty member or staff member, whatever their title, they can be kind of like talking about how they're sort of dealing with all this stuff and seeing how things work one institution to the next. But we will, wrap up now though, with our final question that we're asking everybody: advice for other higher ed leaders navigating this moment.
To make your learning public. If you are willing to try and fail, I think that's the most important thing. And being able to like also share that failure, because that's what's going to help build up the whole community. I think there's still sometimes we have or it happens in workforce too, but I really think within higher ed, that is such an opportunity to collaborate. There is such good like partnerships in all that space. And it's about education already. How do we help to kind of make those things public and share that and have like a discourse, like whether it be here at this conference or online communities or I was at an event last night for people who are, like they have like a 6,000 community on Slack. And so like, but sharing all those kinds of learnings and things will really help to kind of break down doors and get people to try it more. And so it's not just you trying it, but it's also sharing that with others. I think that's my biggest advice.
Yeah, it's great advice. And I think, kind of the humility, showing kind of vulnerability of, kind of, hey, I'm trying to understand more about this, because again, it's been moving so quickly. And I think, thankfully, again, just sort of culturally, I feel like a lot of folks are just willing to kind of like, support and kind of guide each other and, like share resources that are helpful or whatever else. But yeah, I think there are a lot now. I think a lot of people, like it keeps kind of increasing and just being curious around this and wanting to learn more and being kind of public with that and sort of crowdsourcing stuff. Because I think, there's just like a lot of different approaches around ways that you can, maybe kind of play around in a sandbox or like, read up on something or take a course or, whatever else. There's just, I think more and more great resources out there. And I think just kind of, ask for support, publicly and, show your learning publicly and your journey and all that. Cause I think that'll definitely, normalize things for a lot of folks out there in the space. So great advice, great conversation. Appreciate you taking time and sharing all that you did, ways to connect with you and ETS, and the resource that you mentioned in the episode description. Just great talking to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Higher Ed Geek podcast. This show is a proud member of the Enrollify Network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where higher ed goes to grow. So be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit Enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.